Hello, this is the Lord's Legion, and welcome to a brand new countdown. And as you could imagine, you have waited long enough for this one. This is of course going to be the interesting Injustice concept art. A video that is almost a year in the making at this point, although honestly I took about a huge hiatus for about 9 months and it's only now that I've got round into doing this. But nevertheless, since that Injustice 3 will be announced at some point, as well as the fact that they're going to be revisiting that universe in DC Comics, I felt now was as good a time as ever into finally getting this video out there. And unfortunately, since I can't do polls on videos anymore, if you want to vote on which franchise I should look at next as far as concept art are concerned, then the best way to go is by going through my community tab and vote there. But without further ado, let's begin with the countdown. So kicking off the list at number 20, we have Gamma Grundy from Injustice 1. Now, this version of Solomon Grundy is a far cry from the previous iterations of the character in the sense that he does look a lot more undead than usual. And by that I mean that there is no sign of humanity or even so much as a personality within this design for Grundy. Like, you can see some of the green aura around Grundy's body as well as his eyes, and speaking of body, you can see that his flesh is clearly torn apart. And honestly, looking at this version of Solomon Grundy, I feel like this could have potentially have been the scariest version of the character. But at the same time, when you do look at the green aura as well as the fact that the character is only just wearing shredded pants, you can see the similarities between him and the Hulk, and I can kinda understand why they decided to scrap this design. Also from Injustice 1, number 19, we have Emperor Shazam. Now, this costume for Shazam is a huge far cry compared to how we normally see Shazam in the comics or any of the cartoons. And I don't mean just the fact that Shazam is wearing armor, because it's pretty much a thing in the Injustice universe in that everyone wears armor. But what I mean by that is that when you look at this costume for Shazam, it does look very sinister to me. From his pointed shoulder blades to even the villainous looking cape. Now granted, this could have been the original design they were going to go for Shazam, at least with his Regime Ultimate design, but if this was supposed to be the original costume for Shazam, then chances are I don't think many Shazam fans would have liked this costume for him, because it kind of goes against the positive aspects of the character. Coming in at number 18, we have the Penguin from Injustice 2. Now, it remains unclear on whether the Penguin was at some point intended to be a playable character in Injustice 2, alongside many of the other scrapped characters in that game, which I'll go over in a little bit, but either way, it is interesting to see how far they went with the character design-wise. But based on the design, it did seem like they were going to go for a mix between the Batman Returns version of Penguin as well as the New 52 in terms of the overall costume. And as for what role the Penguin would have played within the storyline, or even if he was going to be playable, again remains to be unseen, but based with the amount of guns and umbrellas, it does seem like that would have been a major trait for the character if he were to be playable. But I suppose because of the fact that there were too many Batman villains in Injustice 2, it did kind of make sense for the Penguin to be scrapped inevitably. And speaking of scrapped Batman characters, number 17 we have Bluebeard, also from Injustice 2. I'm not going to pretend that I know a whole lot of this character from the comics, because honestly I have very little knowledge on Bluebeard. All of that aside, I do have to tip my hat for them for actually trying to think outside of the box and bring in a fairly obscure character to the mold, especially someone who is fairly recent in the grand scheme of things. Design-wise, this is a fairly good representation of Bluebeard within the Injustice universe. Again, because of the fact that there were too many Batman characters, and given that there was a higher demand for Red Hood over Bluebeard, it kind of made sense for her to be scrapped ultimately, which is kind of a shame really. Crawling her way to number 16, we have Latex Catwoman from Injustice 1. Now, I don't think many people particularly enjoyed Catwoman's costumes in either Injustice games, but with this original inception of Catwoman, it does lean much closer to the Catwoman that most of us are accustomed to. And yes, although it does have its own bells and whistles in the sense that Catwoman's long hair would be exposed and the cowl would be lacking in goggles, Selina would still maintain the traditional black black latex attire, which does seem to be everyone's preference when it comes down to a Catwoman costume. So for number 15, we have the New 52 Captain Cold from Injustice 2. Now, out of all of the characters in Injustice 2, I do believe that Captain Cold had the least recognizable costume out of the entire roster. Yet, looking at this design for Captain Cold, I'm honestly baffled on why this didn't make it to the final cut. Because while yes, this doesn't resemble the classic Captain Cold from the old comics, this design is meant to be more inspired by the New 52 version of the character. From his icy looking hands, as well as his vest with the similar palette to that of the New 52 Cold, and the most important thing of them all is the fact that he is sporting the hood. And with those easy fixes for Captain Cold's design for Injustice 2, it would have made him stand out all the better. Coming in at number 14, we have Extreme Deathstroke from Injustice 1. And you thought the final design for Deathstroke was too heavy in armor? I think this is a little overkill. In saying that, I do feel like these two particular costumes for Deathstroke that were initially planned were meant to be more inspired by the CW Arrowverse, in the sense that they're both meant to be seen as somewhat unquote more practical as well as realistic, which in a way I do kind of see the inspiration behind those designs, but at the same time I do feel like it's a little too detailed for their own good. Although something that I do appreciate is the different version of Slade's mask, in that it does resemble more of a skull, which in my eyes at least is probably the best thing to come out of those designs. Making their way to number 13, we have Cersei from Injustice 2. A scrapped character who should have been the female sorceress instead of enchantress, as well as being the Wonder Woman villain representative instead of Cheetah. Because as an unpopular opinion, I do feel like Cersei deserved a spot in Injustice 2 more than the enchantress and Cheetah put combined. Now, this design for Cersei does seem unique in the sense that it's meant to be an amalgamation of both the classic as well as the modern iterations of the character, while obviously treating this version of Cersei as their own and having it work within the confines of the Injustice lore. Saying that, since they've already used Ares for Injustice 1 and Cheetah for Injustice 2, the only logical villain within the Wonder Woman's Rogues Gallery would be Cersei for the third game, and I do hope that they do recycle this design for the character. So for number 12, we have the New 52 Red Hood from Injustice 2. Now, on the surface, this initial design for the Red Hood does resemble quite heavily to the final design for the character. However, it's the finer details that do interest me with this initial costume for Jason Todd. The fact that his jacket does have a lot more padding, which does make it all the more practical, as well as having the red bat on his chest, which is sort of lacking with the final default costume for Red Hood. But the biggest thing of this design worthy of note is of course Red Hood's gauntlet, or more specifically the electric blade on his wrist, which was a pretty defining weapon for Red Hood during the New 52 era. Instead, to compensate the lack of gauntlets, they decided to use the pistol whip that does generate electricity through the back, which is still a fine alteration all the same. Coming in at number 11, we have Unhinged Quinn from Injustice 2. This is a pretty creepy design for Harley Quinn in the sense that she does have a torn straitjacket as well as being covered in chains. But even with all of the insanity, she still sports the red and blue hair as well as the red and blue leggings. As far as narrative is concerned, I don't know where this would have fit into the story, aside from maybe being among one of the scenes where Harley is infected by the Scarecrow's fear toxins. But with all of that aside, I do feel like this would have been a pretty badass costume for Harley Quinn, and it is unfortunate to see that this design for hair got scrapped within the final product. It's very creepy, very unique, and it is something that we haven't really seen in the Injustice games thus far for Harley. Making his way to number 10, we have the New 52 Reverse Flash, also from Injustice 2. Now, I should have said that in a loose sense because honestly it does seem like a weird bastardization of the New 52 Reverse Flash as well as the New 52 Zoom. And even when looking at this version of Reverse Flash, he just looks a lot younger than you would expect him to be. And the reason why I have this one placed so highly is because I have no idea where they were trying to go with this character, and it's such a huge far cry compared to the traditional Reverse Flash. But saying that, considering how his role within the story was very minimal at best, chances are all of these changes wouldn't amount to much in the long run. And if anything, it would have done nothing but enrage the fans of Reverse Flash. So for number 9, we have punk-ass Black Canary from Injustice 1. Now, as far as I'm aware, Black Canary was heavily developed, or at the very least heavily considered, for the first Injustice game. Yet, for one reason or another, they decided to completely scrap the character within the 11th hour. But looking at those designs for Black Canary, it did seem like they're going to go more in a punk/biker direction for the character. And while yes, she would have still maintained the biker look as well as the black and yellow aesthetic, but also they were going to go with their own creative liberties by giving her black streaks with her hair as well as some tattoos. Which honestly, I don't think either of those designs are particularly bad per se, but at the same time I do feel like it would have caused a bit of a stir with the Black Canary fans, and that they would have much preferred the classic version. Coming in at number 8, we have Static Shock from Injustice 2. Now, if we were to see this version of Static Shock for the final roster of Injustice 2, he would have been the most unique out of the bunch, both in the sense that he sports next to no armor compared to everyone else, not to mention the fact that this would have been the most drastically different costume for Static Shock in any of the mediums. We see him sporting a cap, he's also sporting some dreadlocks, and seemingly lacking the sleeves, but instead has tattoos. But again, even with all of the creative liberties that they've took with his costume, I can still tell that this is in fact Static Shock, and it does make sense in the narrative sense considering that this would have been a more of a young adult Static. Unfortunately, much like all of the other characters before him, he was inevitably scrapped entirely for reasons unknown. Which is especially surprising given that Static Shock has been one of the most highly demanded characters in Injustice period. Speaking of scrapped characters from Injustice 2, number 7, we have John Constantine. Now, as you can imagine, I am a huge sucker when it comes down to the supernatural, so it does have me all the more gutted in that John Constantine was scrapped from Injustice 2, because looking at this design for him, he looks spot on. And with his casual clothing as well as his knowledge on the dark art, he would have really stood out in the roster. Although the two possible reasons on why Constantine was scrapped in Injustice 2 is that for one, he isn't exactly a fighter, therefore having him being a full-on brawler wouldn't exactly fit with his character. But more importantly, since John Constantine has never been a side character really, that finding a place for him in a story would have been too difficult. Which to me, it is a huge shame because I really love the character of John Constantine. Coming in at number 6, we have 90s looking Nightwing from Injustice 1. Now, as you can see, in some ways this does resemble the final design for Nightwing that we did have, at least from his default, but upon reflection, there are plenty of similarities with his alternate, in which we would soon discover to be the Damien version of Nightwing. And with that, it did seem like they took some of the best elements from this particular concept art and divided them into two completely different costumes, which in the long run would be completely beneficial because while this is a really kick-ass design for Nightwing, I don't think it would work for either Dick or even Damien, because the overall edgy aesthetic wouldn't work for Dick Grayson and the colour palette wouldn't work for Damian Wayne either. Coming in at number 5, we have Crypto from Injustice 2. Now, this is quite possibly about as grounded as you could possibly take with Crypto, because instead of just making him just an ordinary dog with a cape, they decided to go all out in terms of his design by making him resemble more of an intergalactic creature than just a fairy animal. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the elements for Crypto's design were inspired from Zack Snyder's version of Krypton. Comparing this version of Krypton as well as some of the creature designs in Man of Steel that were residing in Krypton, I do feel like there are some parallels between the two here. Moving on to number 4, we have Brainiac infused Grodd from Injustice 2. Now, for all intents and purposes, Gorilla Grodd was the secondary antagonist in Injustice 2 since he was working with Brainiac the entire time. But it is very cool seeing this version of Gorilla Grodd being infused with technology, or what I would assume at least having some of Brainiac's remnants. And it is a little surprising that we didn't get to see Gorilla Grodd sporting any actual tech with his gear, at least not from my memory. Because there are times in comics and even in the animated shows where we would get to see Gorilla Grodd infusing himself with some technology in order to enhance his telepathy. And in a sense, that kind of was his plan in Injustice 2. So scrapping all of the technology gears entirely just seems like a huge missed opportunity in my eyes. Coming in at number 3, we have the true Mr. Freeze from Injustice 2. Now, many people were pretty underwhelmed to learn of him being nothing more than a premium skin for Captain Cold. As for his final design in the game, that had a lot to be desired, but looking at this version of Mr. Freeze in the concept art at least, this does a lot more justice to the character, because not only does he have the iconic dome that was somehow lacking in the game, but he also has more of a traditional ice cannon. And to me at least, having Mr. Freeze being nothing more than a premium skin for a lesser character is a huge disservice for him. Because traditionally, Mr. Freeze also has super strength as well as having plenty of other ice gadgets. And so if they were to bring back Mr. Freeze for Injustice 3, I do feel like they have to completely redo the character and make him his own. So for the runner-up, we have Pure Atlantean Aquaman from Injustice 1. Now, this design for Aquaman is very unique for a multitude of reasons. Case in point, the overall costume for Aquaman does seem as if he is more one with the Atlanteans, to the point where he has embraced more of that side of his heritage rather than his humanity. And of course, he also does have the long hair, which would have been inspired by Jason Momoa as well as the 90s Aquaman. Which in my eyes, this version of Aquaman could have worked in the Injustice universe, but at the same time, with the badass Aquaman that we got in the final product, I'm not going to be complaining. But before we get to number 1, I do want to shout out these different Joker iterations for MK11, because it is very interesting to me in that NetherRealm Studios were contemplating on using those iconic Joker designs for their Joker. From the traditional Jack Nicholson incarnation to the more creepy and sinister Heath Ledger Joker. Not to mention we also have more of the modern flair of the Walking Phoenix Joker and even the scary iteration of the New 52 Joker. And while it is somewhat disappointing in that they never committed into any of those designs for the Joker in Mortal Kombat 11, at the same time, you can't please everyone because they all have their favourite Jokers. And me personally, I would have leaned towards the New 52 Joker because that would have been perfect for the Mortal Kombat universe, but that's just me. Finally, for number 1, we have Etrigan from Injustice 2. Now, seeing this character in the Injustice lore would have been incredible, and it would have been amazing to see him in game. Plus, they did go all out with his character design in that it is very gritty, armoured, but at the same time, you can see that this is in fact Etrigan in the flesh. It kind of baffles me in a way on why they decided to scrap Etrigan at the last minute, but in saying that, given that he is a supernatural character, he would have seemed somewhat out of place in Injustice 2. Even with all of that aside, Etrigan quite possibly has the most badass design out of all of the scrapped characters from Injustice 2, as well as having the most interesting concept art in the Injustice franchise. So which piece of concept art from the Injustice franchise did you personally find to be the most interesting? Comment below and share some thoughts, and don't forget to go on the community tab on my channel for you guys to vote on which franchise I should focus on next. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video, please like and subscribe, take care and have a good one.